The cottage door had not been forced. That was the first thing Duke Sebastian noticed as he stepped over the threshold, his boots silent on the worn floorboards, his breath catching at the sight before him. Nora sat bound to a wooden chair in the center of the small room, her wrists tied behind her back with coarse rope, her chestnut hair falling loose from its pins. A single candle guttered on the table beside her, throwing long shadows across the whitewashed walls. She did not cry out when she saw him. She only lifted her chin, and something passed between them that no words could carry. Nora. He crossed the room in 3 strides, reaching for the knot at her wrists. Don't. Her voice was low, urgent, though her lips barely moved. Not yet. Before he could ask what she meant, the door swung open again, and Lady Vivienne stepped inside, her ivory gown catching the candlelight, 2 of the estate's guards flanking her like well-trained hounds. Her face wore an expression of practiced sorrow, the kind Sebastian had seen her arrange in mirrors before important calls. Sebastian, my love. Vivienne pressed a gloved hand to her chest, as though the sight of him pained her. I did not want you to see this. I wished to spare you. Spare me what, exactly? His voice came out harder than he intended. This creature. Vivienne gestured toward Nora without looking at her directly, as one might gesture toward a stray dog that had wandered too close to the good china. She has been stealing from the estate for months. Silver, letters, even a brooch belonging to your late mother. When my steward caught her tonight, she threatened to spread lies about our family unless she was paid to keep silent. Sebastian said nothing. He had known Nora since she'd come to work in the estate's kitchens 2 years past, had watched her mend torn linens with a steadiness of hand that spoke of a careful, honest nature. The accusations sat wrong in his chest, like a stone swallowed too quickly. But Nora, behind her back, had not stopped moving. Her fingers worked at a sliver of broken glass she had hidden beneath her palm before the guards arrived, sawing patiently at the rope's fibers, careful to keep her shoulders still so the motion would not show. She had learned long ago that a woman who wished to survive in a house like this could not afford to look as clever as she was. She threatened blackmail, Vivienne continued, and I could not simply let such a thing pass unanswered. I have had her held here until matters could be properly addressed. You understand, don't you? A future duchess cannot allow thieves to run loose among the household. Sebastian's eyes moved to Nora, searching her face for some sign of the truth. She gave him nothing but a steady, unreadable calm, the same calm she wore when scrubbing pots at dawn or curtsying to guests she privately thought foolish. It was only her eyes that spoke, flicking once, briefly, toward the pocket of his coat. He did not understand the gesture. Not yet. What do you intend to do with her? He asked, keeping his tone even, though every part of him wanted to cut the ropes himself and demand answers. She will be held in the West Tower until after the wedding, Vivienne said smoothly. It would not do to have this unpleasantness disturb our happy occasion. Afterward, we can decide what mercy, if any, she deserves. The word mercy sat strangely on Vivienne's tongue, as though she were tasting something bitter and pretending to enjoy it. Sebastian's jaw tightened, but he had spent enough years in his father's court to know when a battle could not be won in the open. He inclined his head, a gesture that cost him more than Vivienne would ever know. As you think best, my dear. Relief flickered across Vivienne's face, quickly hidden behind her practiced composure. She nodded to the guards, who moved to lift Nora from the chair. As they did, Nora stumbled slightly against Sebastian's side, her bound hands brushing his coat in a movement so brief it might have been mistaken for an accident. It was not. In that single second, she slipped a small, tightly folded piece of parchment into his coat pocket, her fingers steady despite the rope still loosely gathered at her wrists. Sebastian felt the faint pressure against his ribs and understood, all at once, that nothing about this night was what it appeared to be. He watched as the guards led her from the cottage and toward the looming shape of the estate beyond the trees, her figure growing smaller against the darkened path. Vivienne lingered a moment longer, resting a hand on his arm. You look troubled, she said softly. "I am only tired," he replied. "It has been a long evening." She smiled, satisfied, and left him standing alone in the small cottage, the candle still burning low on the table. Only when her footsteps had faded entirely did Sebastian reach into his coat and draw out the folded parchment Nora had hidden there. His fingers trembled slightly as he unfolded it, the paper thin and worn, as though it had passed through many hands before reaching Nora's. He held it closer to the candlelight, and his breath stilled. Whatever truth lay inside that cottage, he understood now that it was far darker than any tale of theft. And whatever Nora Whitmore truly was, she had just placed something into his hands that could unmake the wedding the entire county had been preparing for. He tucked the parchment carefully away, extinguished the candle, and stepped out into the night, his mind already turning toward the tower where she was being kept. The West Tower had not been used for prisoners in living memory. Sebastian remembered playing in its lower rooms, chasing his sister up the spiral stairs while their nurse scolded them for the dust on their stockings. Now a guard stood at its base with a lantern and an expression that suggested he took his new duty far too seriously for a man who usually did nothing more taxing than polish the stable gates. "Her ladyship said no visitors," the guard said, though his voice wavered when he recognized who stood before him. "Her ladyship is not the master of this house," Sebastian replied. "I am, and I intend to question the prisoner myself, as is my right." The guard hesitated only a moment before stepping aside. Sebastian climbed the narrow stairs alone, his candle throwing wavering light against stone walls that had not felt warmth in years. At the top, behind a heavy oak door fitted with a rusted bolt, he found Nora seated on a narrow cot, her wrists finally free of rope, though a length of chain still bound one ankle to the wall. She rose when she saw him, and for a moment neither spoke. The guard's footsteps could be heard pacing below, close enough that any careless word might carry down through the old stone stairwell. "You read it," she said quietly, not a question. "I have not had the chance." He kept his voice low, matching hers. "I came the moment I could slip away unnoticed." Nora glanced toward the door, then back at him. "Then you must be careful how you speak here. These walls carry sound further than you'd think. When we were little, my mother used to say the tower gossiped worse than the laundry maids." It was an odd thing to say, and yet Sebastian understood at once what she meant. She was warning him that anything spoken plainly might reach ears beyond the guards. He thought of the household ciphers his own mother had taught him and his sister, a private language of turns of phrase meant to pass messages beneath the notice of servants and guests alike. It had been a game once. Tonight it was something else entirely. "The weather has turned strange this season," he said carefully, watching her face. "I found something of yours caught in my coat. A leaf, perhaps, though it smelled less like autumn and more like my aunt's garden tonic." Nora's eyes sharpened at once. The garden tonic was no invention. Sebastian's aunt had once nearly finished from a badly prepared remedy meant to ease her joints, a mixture the household apothecary had warned could turn deadly if measured wrong. It was a phrase the family used sparingly, and only when discussing matters of poison. "The leaf came from Blackwood," Nora said, choosing her words with the same care. "A place my father used to visit for his trade. The particular tonic you mention is not made everywhere. Only certain shops carry ingredients bitter enough to trouble a man's tea without changing its taste." Sebastian's chest tightened. "You believe someone means to use it against me?" "I do not believe. I know." Nora's voice dropped further, barely more than breath. "The note in your pocket was meant for a courier heading to the coast 3 days from now. I found it hidden beneath a loose board in the servants' corridor outside Lady Vivian's chambers while cleaning. I should never have read it, but something in the wax seal troubled me enough to look." "And what did it say?" She hesitated, glancing again toward the door. The guard's footsteps had stopped, which worried her more than their steady rhythm had. She lowered her voice until Sebastian had to lean close to catch her words. "It named an amount and a manner of delivery, timed for the days following your wedding breakfast. I did not understand every phrase, my letters are plain and my knowledge of physic thinner still, but I understood enough to know it was no love letter and no household order for medicine." Sebastian felt something cold settle behind his ribs, the sort of stillness that came before anger rather than after it. Vivian would not. "I did not say her name," Nora said gently. "I said only what I found." But they both understood the shape of what neither wished to say aloud. The note had come from within Vivian's private chambers. Whatever hand had written it, whatever hand meant to carry it to Blackwood, answered first to her. Footsteps sounded on the stairs, heavier this time, accompanied by the guard's voice raised in half-hearted greeting. Sebastian straightened at once, stepping back from the cot as the door creaked open to reveal Vivian herself, a shawl thrown over her nightdress, her expression arranged into gentle concern. "Sebastian, I did not expect to find you here at this hour." "I wished to question her myself," he said, his voice returning smoothly to its earlier calm, though his pulse had not yet slowed. A future duke ought to know the truth of matters concerning his own household, rather than relying entirely on the word of others. "Of course." Vivian's smile did not reach her eyes as she studied Nora's still form on the cot. "And did she confess?" "She denies the theft," Sebastian said, "though I suspect a night alone in this tower may loosen her tongue further before morning." Vivian seemed satisfied with this, though her gaze lingered on Sebastian a moment longer than comfort allowed, as though searching his face for something she could not quite name. "Come then, it is late, and you will need your rest before tomorrow's rehearsal. The whole county will be watching." Sebastian offered Nora one final glance before following Vivian toward the stairs, a glance that carried more than any coded phrase could hold. Nora watched him go, the chain cold against her ankle, and understood that whatever came next, they had only begun to uncover the truth hiding beneath Blackwood's quiet shops and Vivian's carefully arranged smiles. Below, the candle guttered once more in the draught from the closing door, and the tower settled back into silence. Sleep did not come easily in the tower, though Nora made a show of lying still upon the cot for the guard's benefit, listening to his footsteps grow slower and heavier below until they stopped altogether, replaced by the soft, rhythmic breathing of a man who had given up his watch for dreams instead. She waited a while longer still, counting the church bells in the distance until she was certain of the hour, before reaching into the hem of her skirt, where a thin iron hairpin had been sewn since her first week in service, a habit her grandmother had taught her long before either of them ever set foot on this estate. The chain at her ankle proved simple enough. An old lock meant more to discourage than to truly contain, and it gave way with a soft click after a few careful turns of the pin. The door's bolt took longer, stiff with rust, but patience was a skill Nora had practiced her whole life in rooms far less forgiving than this one. When it finally slid free, she paused at the threshold, listening for any change in the guard's breathing below, before slipping past him on feet that made no more sound than a cat crossing a carpet. She did not take the main stairs. Behind a tapestry on the second landing, worn thin from years of dust rather than use, lay a narrow servants' passage built into the old stone walls, the kind every great house kept hidden for the movement of trays and linens without disturbing the family above. Nora had discovered it during her first month at the estate, chasing a runaway cat through what she'd assumed was an empty broom closet, and had kept the knowledge to herself ever since, the way a person keeps any small secret that might one day prove useful. The passage was cold and close, smelling faintly of tallow and old timber, but it carried her swiftly and silently down through the belly of the house, past the kitchens where the last of the coals still glowed dim in the hearth, past the wine cellar with its rows of dusty bottles, until she reached a narrow door that opened directly into the lower study. Sebastian was already there, seated at his father's old desk with a single lamp turned low, the folded parchment spread open before him. He looked up sharply at the sound of the door, relief loosening the tension in his shoulders when he saw who had entered. "You should not have come," he said, though there was no real reproach in his voice. "And you should not have waited up so plainly," Nora replied, crossing the room to stand beside him. "If a servant had found you here at this hour, poring over letters instead of sleeping, questions would follow." "Let them ask questions. It is Vivian's letters that ought to concern this house, not mine." He gestured toward the parchment, and Nora leaned closer to study it properly for the first time in decent light. The note was brief, written in a hand she did not recognize, careful and slanted in a way that suggested someone unused to writing at all, perhaps copying words dictated by another. It spoke of a delivery to be made following the wedding breakfast, a quantity measured in careful drops rather than open amounts, and a price already settled between two parties whose names appeared nowhere on the page. "There," Nora said, pointing to a small mark pressed into the wax at the corner, half torn but still visible. "That is no ordinary seal." Sebastian frowned, tilting the parchment toward the lamp. The mark showed the faint outline of a mortar and pestle, crossed with a sprig of some herb neither of them could name with certainty, encircled by lettering too worn to read in full. "I have seen such marks before," Nora said slowly, memory stirring. "My father traded goods along the coast for a time, before his health failed him. He used to speak of the port apothecaries in Blackwood, each with their own particular stamp pressed into their wax, so buyers might know which shop had prepared a remedy without needing to ask. This looks near enough to one he described, though I cannot say which shop exactly." "Blackwood is half a day's ride," Sebastian said, more to himself than to her. "If this seal belongs to a shop there, someone travelled a fair distance to secure whatever ingredient this note describes. That is not the act of a servant acting alone on some petty grudge. That takes planning, and coin, and reason to keep the matter far from the estate's usual suppliers. Someone who did not wish the household apothecary to notice unusual purchases," Nora finished quietly. They sat with that thought a moment, the lamp flickering between them, before Sebastian spoke again, his voice lower now, more careful. "I must go to Blackwood myself, quietly, before the wedding, before whatever this note describes can be carried out." "Then I will come with you." "Nora, if you are seen away from this house—" "I am already accused of theft and blackmail," she said, a wry edge creeping into her voice despite the gravity of the hour. "What further harm could one journey do my reputation? Besides, you do not know Blackwood as I do. My father took me there. I know its streets, its shopkeepers, the manner of speaking that marks a stranger from a local. You would be lost within the hour, and twice as noticed." Sebastian studied her for a long moment, the lamp casting soft shadows across features that held far more steel than her quiet manner in the estate's kitchens had ever let show. Whatever doubt he carried about the wisdom of bringing her along, it could not outweigh the plain truth of what she offered. "Very well," he said finally. "We leave before dawn, while the household still sleeps and Vivienne believes you safely chained in the tower. I will announce business on my coastal lands, nothing more. You will travel as my scribe, plain dress, nothing to draw the eye." Nora nodded, already turning the plan over in her mind, already thinking of disguises and excuses and the particular walk of a woman who belonged nowhere near a duke's private business. Outside, the first grey hint of dawn had not yet touched the sky, but neither of them mistook the stillness for safety. Somewhere beyond these walls, a courier's journey to Blackwood was already being arranged, and they had precious little time left to reach the truth before it. Dawn broke grey and thin over the estate, the kind of light that promised rain without committing to it, when Sebastian gave word to his stablemaster that he intended to ride out to inspect the coastal boundaries of his land, a matter he claimed had been neglected too long amid the wedding preparations. No one questioned a duke's sudden interest in his own property, though the stablemaster did raise a brow at the sight of the plain, unremarkable carriage Sebastian requested instead of his usual coach. "The good carriage draws too much notice on rough coastal roads," Sebastian explained, and the man accepted this without further thought, already turning to see the horses readied. Nora waited near the servants' entrance, dressed not in her usual kitchen apron, but in a modest grey travelling dress, borrowed quietly from the housekeeper's stores, her hair pinned beneath a plain bonnet that shadowed her face well enough to pass unnoticed. She carried a leather satchel stuffed with paper and ink, the picture of a scribe accompanying her master on business too tedious for anyone else to bother with. When Sebastian's carriage rolled to a stop beside her, she climbed in without a word, and the door closed behind them before any early-rising servant thought to look twice. The journey to Blackwood took the better part of the morning, the road winding first through fields still silvered with dew, then narrowing as it climbed toward the coast, where the air grew sharper with salt and the cries of gulls replaced the quiet birdsong of the estate grounds. Nora kept her eyes on the passing scenery, though her mind turned constantly to the parchment folded carefully in Sebastian's coat and the mark pressed into its wax that had brought them this far. "You said your father traded here," Sebastian said, as the first rooftops of the port town came into view. "Yet you have said little of what became of him." Nora's expression did not change, though something in her shoulders drew tighter. "He fell ill some years past, a sickness of the lungs from too many seasons at sea. We came here often when I was young, before his health failed him. I know the harbour better than I know my own kitchen garden." Sebastian did not press further, sensing the weight behind her brief answer, and turned his attention instead to the practical matter before them. "How do you propose we find this particular apothecary among however many the town holds?" "By its mark," Nora said, drawing the parchment carefully from where Sebastian had tucked it, studying the torn wax seal once more. "Every reputable shop presses its symbol into whatever it sells, whether medicine or dye or tonic. My father used to say a man could read a shopkeeper's honesty in how carefully he stamped his wares. This mortar crossed with the sprig, I have seen something near it before, though I cannot place exactly where." The carriage rolled to a stop near the harbour's edge, close enough to the water that the smell of fish and tar hung thick in the air, but far enough from the main thoroughfare that their arrival drew little notice among the fishermen and dockhands going about their morning trade. Sebastian stepped down first, offering Nora his hand more out of habit than necessity, though she took it briefly before releasing it just as quickly, mindful of the eyes that might be watching even here. "I will remain near the harbour road," Sebastian said quietly, adjusting his coat to sit plainer across his shoulders, less like a nobleman's fine tailoring and more like a merchant's practical dress. "If anyone from the estate has followed, or if word of our journey reached ears it should not have, I would rather see them before they see us together. You know these streets, I do not. Find the shop and I will watch the road." Nora nodded, tucking a loose strand of hair beneath her bonnet before setting off along the narrow cobbled street that curved away from the harbour toward the row of shops she remembered from past visits long past. Many had changed hands since then, their signs repainted, their windows displaying different wares, but the particular rhythm of the street remained familiar enough to guide her steps without hesitation. She passed a baker's shop, its windows fogged with the warmth of the morning's first loaves, and a rope maker's stall where thick coils hung drying in the salt air, before her eyes caught on a narrow shop front tucked between two larger buildings, its window lined with glass jars of dried herbs and coloured tinctures, and above its door, painted in faded gold, the very mark she had been searching for, a mortar crossed with a sprig of some bitter herb, encircled by lettering now clear enough to read. "Corwin's Apothecary, established by royal licence." Nora paused across the street, studying the shop a long moment before glancing back the way she had come. Sebastian stood near the harbour road, positioned casually against a low stone wall, his attention seemingly fixed on the boats bobbing in the water, though Nora had no doubt his eyes tracked every figure that passed near enough to notice him. She caught his gaze briefly across the distance and gave the smallest nod, confirmation enough that she had found what they sought. He did not approach. That had been their agreement, whispered in the carriage on the ride down. If both of them entered together, a duke and his scribe asking careful questions of an apothecary, suspicion would follow as surely as smoke follows fire. Better that Nora alone, dressed plainly and speaking with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged to these streets, should test the shopkeeper's willingness to talk, while Sebastian remained near enough to reach her should trouble arise, but distant enough that no one watching the harbour road would think to connect them. Nora smoothed the front of her borrowed dress, steadied her breathing, and crossed the street toward Corwin's door, the small bell above the frame already audible in her mind before her hand had even touched the latch. Whatever answers waited inside that narrow shop, she intended to have them before the sun climbed much higher over Blackwood's rooftops. The bell above the door rang thin and bright as Nora stepped inside, and the smell hit her at once. Dried herbs and beeswax, and something sharper beneath it all, the particular bitterness of tinctures left too long uncorked. Shelves lined every wall from floor to ceiling, crowded with glass jars labeled in a cramped hand, their contents ranging from ordinary chamomile to substances Nora could not begin to name. Behind a narrow counter stood a stooped man with spectacles perched low on his nose, counting coins into a small wooden box, with the unhurried patience of someone who had done the same task every morning for 30 years. "Good morning," Nora said, pitching her voice into something warmer and more assured than she felt. The voice she imagined a wealthy house manager might use when addressing a tradesman she considered beneath her notice, but useful nonetheless. "I am told your shop carries the finest botanicals on this stretch of coast. My mistress sent me to secure a particular remedy for her joints, something rare, not the common tonics sold at every crossroads stall." The shopkeeper looked up, his expression brightening at the prospect of a discerning customer willing to pay for quality. "Corwin's has served this port for 2 generations, miss. Whatever your mistress requires, I dare say we can provide it, provided you can tell me what troubles her particularly." "A stiffness in the joints, worse in damp weather," Nora said, drawing on half-remembered complaints from elderly relatives long past. Though she is particular about her tonics, she once purchased something similar through a household order, delivered by courier rather than collected in person. I wondered if your shop kept a record of such arrangements, so I might request the same preparation again without troubling her to describe it twice. It was a delicate lie, built on the assumption that a shop proud enough to stamp its wares with a royal license might also keep careful records, the sort of pride that made men careless with the details they chose to share. Corwin's brow furrowed slightly, considering. "We do keep a sales ledger, miss, though I cannot simply hand over another customer's private business without knowing your mistress's name." "Of course not," Nora said smoothly, allowing a note of mild offense to color her tone, as though the very suggestion of impropriety wounded her professional pride. "I would not ask you to breach any confidence. I only hoped, if I described the general nature of the order, you might recall whether such an arrangement passed through your books recently. My mistress is not a patient woman, and I would rather return with useful information than empty hands." The shopkeeper's expression softened at her apparent distress, the particular sympathy tradesmen often showed towards servants caught between a demanding employer and an impossible task. "Well, I suppose there's no harm in glancing through recent entries, provided you understand I'll not read out names that aren't yours to hear." "Naturally," Nora said, and stepped closer to the counter as he turned to retrieve a thick, leather-bound ledger from a shelf behind him. While he searched, murmuring to himself as he traced a finger down columns of cramped handwriting, Nora let her eyes wander the shop with practiced casualness, noting the layout, the position of the door, the small back room half hidden behind a curtain where deliveries were likely prepared before being sent out. When Corwin finally paused, tapping a particular entry with evident satisfaction, Nora leaned forward as though merely curious, though her heart had begun to beat faster. "Here we are, 3 weeks past. A private order, quantity specified precisely, collected rather than delivered, if my memory of that morning serves. A gentleman's manservant, well-dressed, paid in full without haggling over price, which I do remember, as few customers pay the full asking rate for goods of this particular rarity." "Did he give a name for the record?" Nora asked, keeping her voice light. "Household accounts rarely list a manservant's own name, miss, only the estate he serves." Corwin turned the ledger slightly, enough that Nora's eyes, quick and practiced from years of reading household inventories in service, caught the entry before he thought to close the book again. The estate's name was written plainly enough, along with a description that matched, unmistakably, the household of Vivienne's own family seat, the very estate where her father still resided as head of the line. Not Sebastian's household, Vivienne's own family. Nora's breath caught, though she kept her expression carefully neutral, aware that any sudden change might raise the shopkeeper's suspicion. "That is most helpful. Might I trouble you for a written copy of the entry, so my mistress might see the arrangement matches what she recalls?" Corwin hesitated only briefly before shrugging, more concerned with the coin Nora produced from her satchel than with any deeper question of why a house manager would need such precise proof. "I suppose a copy causes no harm, provided the name of the purchasing household remains between us, and not gossiped about the docks. "You have my word," Nora said, and meant it, though not in the way Corwin likely imagined. He copied the entry onto a fresh scrap of paper in his own careful hand, the details of quantity, date, and household matching precisely what the courier note had described, before folding it and passing it across the counter, along with a small paper packet of ordinary chamomile, added as a courtesy for her trouble. Nora thanked him warmly, tucked both items into her satchel, and left the shop with the bell ringing once more behind her. Outside, the morning sun had climbed higher over the harbour, and Sebastian still stood near the low stone wall, though his posture had grown tenser in her absence. She crossed the street toward him without hurrying, though every part of her wanted to run, the folded receipt burning against her side like a coal pulled fresh from the hearth. "Well?" he asked quietly as she reached him. "It was not simply a servant acting alone," Nora said, her voice barely above a whisper despite the noise of the harbour around them. "The purchase was made through her own family's household, 3 weeks past, paid in full by a manservant matching Vivian's description exactly. Sebastian, this reaches further than her chambers. It reaches into her father's house as well." Sebastian's face, already pale with the strain of the morning, went a shade paler still, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the weight of what she had uncovered settling between them like a stone dropped into still water. They said little as they walked back toward the carriage, the receipt tucked carefully into Nora's satchel alongside the chamomile that now felt like an unwelcome joke, a courtesy gift from a shopkeeper who had no notion of what his ledger had just revealed. Sebastian handed her up into the carriage with the same practiced ease as before, though his jaw stayed tight, his eyes scanning the harbour road one final time before he climbed in after her and rapped twice against the roof to signal the driver. "Her father's household," Sebastian said, once the carriage had rolled clear of the town's outer lanes, the words tasting bitter even as he spoke them. "That means this was planned before Vivian ever set foot in my house as a bride. Planned before the betrothal was even announced publicly." "Or planned the very moment it was," Nora said quietly. 3 weeks past is not so distant from when the wedding date was first fixed." Sebastian said nothing to that, staring instead out the small carriage window at the coastal road unwinding behind them, hedgerows and low stone walls blurring past in the grey morning light. Nora watched him a moment before turning her own attention to the satchel at her feet, checking again that the receipt remained safely folded within its pages, though she had checked it twice already since leaving the shop. The road narrowed as it climbed away from the coast, flanked on either side by dense stands of trees that had not yet been cleared for farmland, the sort of stretch where a carriage's pace slowed naturally to accommodate the uneven ground. It was here, as the horses laboured up a gentle rise, that Nora first heard it. The drum of hooves approaching fast from behind, too fast for casual travellers on a quiet coastal lane. "Sebastian!" Her voice came sharp, and he was already turning toward the small rear window before she finished speaking. 2 riders had appeared on the road behind them, cloaked despite the mild weather, their horses pushed hard enough to close the distance quickly. Sebastian recognized the livery beneath one rider's cloak in the instant before the man drew a pistol from his coat, not aimed to fire, but held plainly enough as threat, and any doubt about their purpose vanished entirely. "Down," Sebastian said, pulling Nora low against the carriage seat as he leaned forward to bang his fist against the driver's small hatch. "Faster, whatever the road allows. We are followed." The driver, a steady man named Hollis, who had served the estate for years and asked no questions he did not need answered, cracked the reins hard, and the carriage lurched forward with a suddenness that threw Nora briefly against Sebastian's shoulder before she caught herself, one hand gripping the satchel tight against her chest, as though the receipt inside might somehow be shaken loose and lost. "They mean to stop us, not harm us outright," Sebastian said, watching through the small window as the riders gained ground despite Hollis's efforts. "Whoever sent them wants what we carry, not blood on a public road where questions would follow." "That is small comfort at this speed," Nora said, though there was a thread of dry humour beneath the fear in her voice, the kind that surfaced in her at odd moments, a habit her mother had once scolded her for and her father had quietly encouraged. Sebastian allowed himself the ghost of a smile despite the danger, then reached past her to the small compartment beneath the carriage seat, where a coachman's whip was kept for emergencies the horse's own pace could not resolve. "Take the papers. Beneath the floorboard. There, the loose panel near your foot. My father built this carriage with more than one secret, back when smugglers still worked this coast and a nobleman's coin was worth robbing." Nora worked quickly, prying up the panel Sebastian indicated with fingers that trembled only slightly, tucking the folded receipt and the original courier note both into the narrow space beneath before pressing the panel back into place, smoothing the carriage's worn floor covering over it, so no casual glance would reveal the hiding spot. Sebastian, meanwhile, had climbed halfway out the carriage's small side window, bracing himself against the frame with one hand while reaching for the reins Hollis passed back to him without question, the two of them working in a rhythm born of years riding these same coastal roads together. The whip cracked once, twice, urging the horses to a pace that made the carriage groan and sway dangerously on the rough ground. But it gained them precious distance from the pursuing riders. One rider drew close enough that Nora could see his face beneath the cloak's hood. A hard, unfamiliar man with a scar along his jaw, his pistol still raised but unfired, his focus clearly fixed on forcing the carriage to stop rather than on causing harm outright. Sebastian, seeing the danger of the narrow road ahead, made a sudden decision, hauling the reins hard to the left, where a break in the trees revealed a rougher forest path, barely more than a deer track, unsuited to fast riding, but narrow enough that a horse and rider would struggle to keep pace with a carriage built for exactly this kind of coastal terrain. The carriage lurched off the main road with a violence that sent Nora sliding hard against the seat's edge, her satchel nearly flying from her grip before she caught it again. And for a long, breathless stretch, the world became nothing but the crack of branches against the carriage's sides, the frantic rhythm of hooves, and Sebastian's low, steady voice urging the horses onward, despite the danger of the uneven ground. Behind them, the pursuing riders slowed at the tree line, their horses unwilling or unable to follow into terrain so poorly suited to speed, and gradually the sound of pursuit faded beneath the carriage's own noise, until at last Sebastian eased the horses back to a manageable pace, his chest heaving, his hands raw from the reins. "They will not give up so easily," he said, glancing back through the rear window at the empty forest path behind them. "Vivian's father has more riders than these two, and more reasons than ever now to want that carriage panel found before we reach the estate." Nora said nothing, still catching her breath, one hand pressed flat against the floorboard where the evidence lay hidden, and for the first time since the cottage, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of fear she had kept carefully buried since the moment the ropes first bound her wrists. The forest path grew rougher still as they pressed onward, until at last one wheel struck a hidden root with a crack loud enough to make both horses shy, and the carriage tilted sharply before settling at an angle that made further travel impossible. Sebastian climbed down at once to inspect the damage, running a hand along the splintered wheel rim while Hollis held the horses steady, his usual calm expression tightening into something closer to worry. "It will not turn another mile," Sebastian said, straightening, "not without proper repair and no wheelwright within reach tonight." The light had already begun to fail around them, the forest canopy thick enough to hasten the coming dark, and Nora, climbing down after him with her satchel clutched close, felt the day's exhaustion settle over her all at once, the ache in her legs and the dryness in her throat suddenly impossible to ignore now that the immediate danger had passed. "There is shelter not far from here," Hollis offered, nodding toward a break in the trees where the ground rose gently. "An old huntsman's lodge, built for your grandfather's hunting parties, my lord, though I doubt it has seen use in a decade or more. Stone walls, at least, and a hearth if the chimney has not fallen in." Sebastian glanced at Nora, who nodded despite her weariness, and the three of them made their way on foot along a narrow deer track, leading the horses behind them, until the lodge came into view through the thinning trees, squat and grey against the darkening sky, its small windows shuttered, but its door still hanging true on rusted hinges. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old smoke, but the hearth proved sound, and Hollis set about coaxing a fire from dry kindling stacked in a corner, while Sebastian secured the horses beneath a lean-to attached to the lodge's rear wall. Nora found a stub of candle in a drawer near the single table, and by the time the fire had caught properly, the small room had taken on a rough sort of warmth, shadows dancing against stone walls that had sheltered hunting parties long before any of them had been born. "Hollis will keep watch through the first hours," Sebastian said, settling onto a bench across from Nora once the older man had taken a position near the shuttered window, a hunting rifle from the lodge's stores resting across his knees. "We should use what time we have to make certain the evidence survives whatever comes next." Nora drew the receipt and courier note from her satchel, laying them carefully on the table between them, and for a moment neither spoke, watching the firelight flicker across the damning words. "If Vivian's people search the carriage before we return, or seize it entirely to hide the wheel's damage from prying eyes, we lose everything we have gathered. Then we do not risk everything on a single copy." Sebastian reached for the paper and ink Nora had carried in her satchel, the same tools meant to disguise her as his scribe, now serving their true purpose. "We transcribe it again, tonight, in a hand that cannot be traced to either of us, and you will carry one copy hidden on your person while I carry the other. If one is found, the second still survives." They worked together by candlelight, Nora reading the courier note aloud in a whisper, while Sebastian copied its words in a plain, unremarkable hand, then reversing the task for the shopkeeper's receipt, checking each line twice against the original before either would be satisfied. The careful work steadied something in Nora's chest, gave her hands a task to focus on beyond the fear that had chased her since the forest road, and gradually, the tightness in her shoulders eased as the second set of copies took shape. "We cannot simply present these to the household and expect justice," Sebastian said, once the copies lay finished, the ink drying slowly in the firelight. "Vivienne's father holds influence enough to challenge any accusation brought quietly, and if we move too soon, she will simply claim the evidence forged, a plot by a spurned servant and a foolish duke too trusting of her word." "Then it must happen where she cannot deny it," Nora said slowly, an idea forming even as she spoke it aloud. "Somewhere public enough that denial becomes impossible, yet controlled enough that the accusation cannot be dismissed as mere spectacle." Sebastian considered this, staring into the fire as the shape of a plan began to form between them, tentative at first, then firmer as they spoke it through together, weighing each risk against the next. The wedding itself, still days away, offered exactly the kind of setting they needed, a gathering too large and too witnessed for Vivian to simply sweep aside with practiced tears, provided the proof could be presented at precisely the right moment, before any harm could be done, and while enough guests remained present to prevent quiet dismissal. "It cannot happen carelessly," Sebastian said. "If we accuse her too early, she has time to arrange her defense, perhaps even to silence you before the wedding day arrives at all. We must return to the estate as though nothing has changed, continue the preparations, let her believe her plan proceeds unhindered until the moment itself." Nora nodded, though the thought of returning to that tower, of playing the role of a captured servant once more, while carrying knowledge dangerous enough to unmake a noble house, settled heavy in her stomach. And the note that first named the goblet. If her family already moved once to hide the toxin's purchase, they may move again before the wedding to change their method entirely. "Then we watch closely," Sebastian said, "and trust that pride, more than caution, guides people who have never before been questioned." Outside, the wind picked up through the trees, rattling the lodge's old shutters, and Hollis shifted at his post by the window, though no further sound of pursuit reached them through the darkness. Nora folded the fresh copies carefully, tucking one set deep into the lining of her borrowed dress, while Sebastian secured the other within his coat, and for the first time since the cottage, a fragile sense of purpose settled between them, sharper now than fear, steady enough to carry them through whatever remained before the wedding day arrived. They rode back to the estate before first light, the carriage wheel bound with rope and green branches enough to limp the final miles at a careful pace, Hollis guiding the horses along the quieter lanes that skirted the main road entirely. By the time the estate's chimneys came into view against the grey morning sky, the household had only just begun to stir, kitchen fires being lit, none of them sparing more than a passing glance for a battered carriage returning from an errand no one had thought to question in the first place. Nora slipped away from the carriage before it reached the main courtyard, disappearing instead toward the servants' entrance, where the hidden passage behind the tapestry waited to carry her back up to the tower unseen. She moved quickly through the narrow stone corridor, her borrowed dress already changed back into the plain wool she had worn the night of her capture, folded copies of the evidence still hidden carefully within its seams. The tower door, left unlocked in their haste the night before, required only a moment's work to secure again from the inside. The chain looped loosely around her ankle once more, enough to satisfy a guard's casual glance without truly binding her. She had barely settled onto the cot, catching her breath, when footsteps sounded on the stairs below, the guard's voice raised in brief conversation with someone Nora did not recognize, before the bolt slid back and a young maid entered, carrying a tray of bread and weak tea, her eyes darting nervously toward Nora, as though uncertain whether prisoners deserved kindness or suspicion. "Her ladyship says you're to eat," the maid said quietly, setting the tray down. "Wedding rehearsals this afternoon. Whole house is in an uproar over it." Nora thanked her softly, and the maid left as quickly as she had come, the door bolting shut once more behind her. Alone again, Nora allowed herself a long breath, the tension of the journey finally catching up with her now that stillness had returned, though she knew better than to let herself rest for long. Below, in the estate's grand hall, Sebastian had already changed from his travelling clothes into attire suited to a duke overseeing the final preparations for his own wedding, and found Vivienne waiting near the long dining table, directing servants in the placement of silver and linen with the brisk efficiency of a woman who left nothing to chance. "You look tired," Vivienne observed as he approached, studying his face with an attentiveness that felt, to Sebastian's newly wary eyes, less like affection and more like assessment. "Did your business on the coast prove troublesome?" "Only the usual complaints from tenant farmers about drainage and boundary fences," Sebastian said smoothly, the lie coming easier than he expected. There's something in his chest tightened at how naturally it left him now, after so many years of honest dealing with the people around him. "Nothing worth troubling you with, especially not today." Vivienne smiled, apparently satisfied, and returned her attention to the table settings, though Sebastian noticed her steward, a thin, sharp-featured man named Halloway, who had served her family for years, watching him a moment longer than courtesy required before turning back to his own tasks. It was Halloway, Sebastian suspected, though he had no proof beyond instinct, who had likely arranged the ambush on the coastal road, or at least carried word of their journey to whoever had sent the riders. The rehearsal itself proceeded through the afternoon, with all the tedious formality such occasions demanded, guests beginning to arrive from neighboring estates for the following day's ceremony, the Archbishop's assistant walking them through the order of vows and blessings, while Vivienne stood at Sebastian's side, her hand resting lightly on his arm, playing the devoted bride for an audience of watching relatives and household staff. Sebastian played his own part with equal care, offering Vivienne small smiles, murmured words meant to appear affectionate to anyone observing, all while his mind worked steadily at the plan he and Nora had shaped in the huntsman's lodge. He needed Halloway away from the estate, if only for an hour, long enough to confirm his suspicions and, if possible, to draw out some further piece of the plot before the wedding day arrived. The opportunity came during a lull in the rehearsal, when Vivienne stepped aside to consult with the cook over the wedding breakfast's final menu, leaving Sebastian a rare moment unobserved. He found Halloway near the wine cellar, overseeing the delivery of several casks meant for the celebration, and approached with the easy manner of a man making idle conversation, rather than pursuing any deeper purpose. "Halloway, I trust everything proceeds smoothly for tomorrow." "As smoothly as such occasions ever do, my lord," Halloway replied, his tone carefully neutral, though Sebastian caught the faint tightening around his eyes. "I confess I grow anxious," Sebastian said, allowing a note of genuine-sounding worry into his voice. "There is a matter I wished settled before the ceremony, concerning arrangements her ladyship's father requested. I would send word myself, but I understand you have better means of reaching him quickly than the household's usual courier." It was a calculated risk, a suggestion vague enough to seem innocent, yet pointed enough, Sebastian hoped, to press on whatever urgency already sat beneath Halloway's careful composure. The steward's expression flickered, something close to alarm passing quickly behind his eyes before he mastered it. "I had, in fact, already planned a visit to the courier post this evening, my lord, on a separate matter entirely. I can certainly carry any message you wish added." "No need to trouble yourself with mine," Sebastian said, waving a hand as though the matter had already lost its urgency. "I only wished to know the post remained reliable. Attend to your own business first." Holloway inclined his head and returned to overseeing the wine delivery, but Sebastian noted, with a satisfaction he kept carefully hidden, the way the man excused himself from the rehearsal not 20 minutes later, slipping away toward the stables with the particular haste of someone whose careful plans had just been disturbed by an offhand remark he could not quite dismiss as harmless. Whatever letter Holloway now rushed to send, Sebastian intended to make certain it never reached wherever it was meant to go. The evening settled over the estate with the particular hush that came before a wedding, the last of the rehearsal guests retreating to their rooms to dress for supper, the household staff moving through their duties with the quiet efficiency of people who knew tomorrow would allow no such calm. In the West Tower, Nora sat listening to the muffled sounds below, waiting for the one signal she had arranged with Sebastian before their return that morning. 3 soft taps against the tower's outer wall, a code borrowed from the household's old cipher games, meant to reach her through the narrow window rather than risk another spoken conversation the guard might overhear. The taps came just after the supper bell had rung through the great hall, and Nora crossed to the window to find, not Sebastian as she expected, but old Ambrose, the estate's head butler, standing below in the fading light with a coil of rope looped over one shoulder and an expression that suggested he had made peace with whatever risk this errand carried. "His lordship sent me," Ambrose said quietly, keeping his voice low enough that it would not carry to the guard below. "Holloway rides for the courier post within the hour. His lordship believes the letter he carries names the final arrangement for tomorrow's ceremony and asks that you intercept it, if you're able, before it reaches wherever it's bound." Nora had known Ambrose since her first week in service, a steady, quiet man who had never once raised his voice to a scullery maid nor spoken ill of the household staff beneath him, and though she had not expected his involvement, something in his calm presence settled her nerves rather than adding to them. "The chain and the door," she said, already reaching for the iron hairpin still sewn into her skirt's hem. "Leave the door to me," Ambrose replied. "I've a reason enough to visit the tower this evening, checking the guard's supper tray. Nothing more suspicious than an old servant fussing over his duties. The window and the rope, however, will need your own hand." It took only minutes to work the chain free once the guard's attention had been drawn elsewhere by Ambrose's arrival at the tower's base, and Nora secured the rope Ambrose had left coiled beneath the window to the old iron bracket that had once held a lantern outside the tower wall, testing its hold twice before trusting her weight to it. The climb down proved harder than the passage through the servants' corridor had been, her hands raw by the time her feet touched solid ground. But no alarm was raised, Ambrose's steady conversation with the guard above covering whatever small sounds she made in her descent. The boundary road lay a fair distance from the main house, winding along the estate's eastern edge, where a narrow iron gate marked the division between Sebastian's land and the public lane beyond, the very route any courier bound for the coast would need to travel. Nora moved through the darkening grounds with practiced care, keeping to hedgerows and the shadow of old stone walls, until she reached the gate itself and settled into the cover of a thick hawthorn bush to wait. She did not have to wait long. The sound of hooves reached her within the half-hour, a single rider moving at a determined pace along the lane, and Nora recognized Holloway's thin, upright posture even in the poor light, a leather satchel slung across his shoulder in a manner that suggested he guarded its contents carefully. The gate itself, old and narrow, had been built in an age when carriages were smaller and riders more patient, its hinges stiff enough that anyone passing through needed to slow considerably to avoid catching a stirrup or a coat against the ironwork. Nora had noticed this weakness during her earlier scouting of the grounds, back when she first learned the estate's layout during her first months in service, and she had gambled everything on Holloway's own haste working against him now. As his horse approached the gate, still moving faster than the narrow passage properly allowed, Nora stepped out just enough to fling a length of loose rope, salvaged from her earlier climb, across the gate's lower bars, catching the horse's foreleg at precisely the moment it attempted to pass through. The animal stumbled, shying hard to one side with a frightened whinny, and Holloway, caught off guard, was thrown forward against the gate's ironwork, his satchel slipping from his shoulder as he fought to control the panicked horse. Nora moved quickly, snatching the fallen satchel before Holloway had fully regained his balance, and slipped back into the shadow of the hawthorn bush as he cursed and struggled to calm his mount, too occupied with the horse to notice the figure disappearing into the darkness behind him. "Blasted animal," he muttered, finally settling the horse enough to dismount and search the ground near the gate, his hands patting at the dirt in growing panic as he realized the satchel had vanished. He searched for several minutes, muttering under his breath, before apparently deciding the bag had simply fallen somewhere along the lane behind him, and rode on toward the courier post at a slower, warier pace, unaware that its true contents had already been carried away. Nora waited until the sound of his hoofbeats faded entirely before daring to open the satchel by the faint moonlight filtering through the hawthorn's branches. Inside, beneath a few unremarkable household receipts meant to disguise the bag's true purpose, she found a single sealed letter, the wax pressed with a signet she did not recognize, but felt certain belonged to Vivian's own hand. Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal, unfolding the letter carefully, and read words that made her breath catch entirely. The instruction was plain, precise, stripped of any softening language, naming the wedding toast goblet directly, the exact moment during the ceremony's celebration when the prepared substance was to be added, and the servant among the estate's own staff who had already been bribed to carry out the final act. Nora refolded the letter with hands that had gone suddenly cold despite the mild evening air, understanding now, with a clarity that settled deep and heavy in her chest, precisely how little time remained before tomorrow's wedding, and precisely how much depended on reaching Sebastian with this final proof before the sun rose again over the estate. The morning of the wedding arrived pale and still, mist clinging low over the estate's gardens as guests began arriving in carriages that lined the drive from the main gate to the cathedral steps. The whole county gathered to witness what everyone believed would be a joyous union between the Duke and his bride. Inside the great stone cathedral, candles burned along the aisle, flowers arranged with careful precision along every pew, and the household staff moved through their final preparations with the particular tension of people who sensed, without quite understanding why, that something in the air did not sit right. Nora had spent what remained of the previous night in the tower once more, the intercepted letter hidden alongside the earlier copies within the seams of her dress, waiting for Ambrose's signal that the household's attention had turned fully toward the ceremony's preparations, leaving the estate's smaller passages unwatched. He came for her an hour before dawn, leading her not toward the main house, but toward a small chamber near the cathedral's rear entrance, where the chapel attendants traditionally prepared themselves before assisting with the morning's rites. "The senior attendant takes ill most years around this season," Ambrose explained quietly, producing a set of heavy robes and a thick veil from beneath his coat, garments Nora recognized as belonging to the woman who oversaw the altar's preparation, a role that placed her close to the communion vessels without drawing undue attention from guests focused entirely on the bride and groom. "She has taken a tonic to ease a supposed fever this morning, at my quiet suggestion, and will not be missed until well past the ceremony's conclusion." Nora dressed quickly in the borrowed robes, the heavy fabric and thick veil swallowing her familiar shape entirely, transforming her into little more than a shadow among the other attendants moving quietly about the cathedral's rear chambers. She had attended enough services during her years in the household to know the rhythm of the morning's rites, the particular order in which vessels were prepared, blessed, and set upon the altar before the ceremony proper began, and she used that knowledge now to move among the other attendants without drawing a single curious glance. The silver communion vessel sat prepared on a side table in the vestry, polished to a brilliant shine, already filled with the wine meant for the ceremony's blessing before being transferred to the grander goblet used for the wedding toast itself, following the county's particular tradition of blending the sacred rite with the celebratory one. Nora's hands trembled slightly as she approached the table, aware of the other attendants moving nearby, aware that a single misstep, a single suspicious motion, could unravel everything she and Sebastian had worked to uncover. She had brought with her, hidden beneath the robes, a small glass flask filled with plain water, coloured faintly with a touch of wine to match the vessel's true contents, closely enough to pass a casual glance. It was Sebastian's idea, discussed in whispered fragments during their brief, stolen moments over the past days, a plan simpler in execution than anything else they had attempted, relying entirely on the confusion and reverence of the morning's rites to provide the cover Nora needed. She waited until the other attendants turned their attention to arranging flowers along the altar's edge, a task that drew every eye toward the far end of the vestry, before reaching for the silver vessel with steady hands, exchanging its true contents for the flask she carried, working quickly enough that the motion appeared, to anyone glancing her way, like nothing more than an attendant adjusting the vessel's position before it was carried to the altar. The true wine, along with whatever else had been added to it by hands loyal to Vivian's family, she poured carefully into the now empty flask, sealing it tight and tucking it back beneath her robes, evidence more damning than any letter or ledger entry could provide, proof that would need no interpretation once presented before witnesses. The ceremony itself began not long after, the great cathedral doors opening to admit the wedding party, Vivian, radiant in white silk and pearls, moving up the aisle on her father's arm with the composed grace of a woman who believed her plans had proceeded exactly as intended. Sebastian stood waiting at the altar, dressed in his finest, his expressions schooled into the appropriate mixture of solemnity and quiet joy expected of a groom on his wedding day, though Nora, watching from her position near the altar's edge, could see the tension coiled beneath his careful composure. The Archbishop began the familiar rites, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed cathedral, guests seated in careful rows, watching with the particular attention such occasions commanded. Nora moved through her assigned duties as attendant with practiced calm, assisting with the blessing of the vessels, standing close enough to the altar to watch every step of the ceremony's progression, her heart beating loud enough in her own ears that she wondered briefly whether anyone nearby might hear it. When the moment came for the vessels to be blessed, the Archbishop lifted the silver goblet, now filled with nothing more dangerous than water tinted faintly with wine, and spoke the traditional words over it without the slightest indication that anything had changed from the ceremony's usual course. Vivian watched with an expression of practiced piety, her father seated in the front pew with the satisfied bearing of a man who believed the morning's final obstacle had already been cleared. Nora caught Sebastian's eye across the altar's width, the smallest fraction of a nod passing between them, confirmation that the exchange had succeeded, that whatever poison had been prepared for this morning's celebration now sat harmless in a glass flask hidden beneath a borrowed attendant's robe, rather than in the vessel meant to pass from the bride's hands to the groom's lips before the assembled guests. The blessing concluded, and the Archbishop moved toward the vows themselves, his voice steady and unhurried, unaware that the true drama of the morning had already been decided in the vestry's quiet corner, long before a single word of the ceremony proper had been spoken. Nora stepped back from the altar, retreating toward the shadows near the cathedral's side wall, the flask heavy against her ribs, and watched as Sebastian straightened his shoulders, drawing a breath that seemed to steady something deep within him, preparing himself for what she knew must come next. The Archbishop's voice had reached the exchange of vows, the cathedral holding its breath in the particular silence that settles over a crowd, watching two lives about to be joined, when Sebastian raised a hand and spoke a single word. Stop. The word carried further than he expected in the hushed stone chamber, and every head turned as one, guests craning forward in their pews, the Archbishop pausing mid-sentence, with his mouth still slightly open around the vow he had not finished speaking. Vivienne's expression flickered, confusion giving way quickly to alarm as Sebastian stepped back from the altar rather than toward her. Sebastian, what is the meaning of this? Her voice carried the practiced distress of a woman accustomed to commanding sympathy, though something harder flickered beneath it now, a wariness that had not been there a moment before. Forgive the interruption to a ceremony the whole county has gathered to witness, Sebastian said, his own voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. But I cannot speak vows before God and these good people while a matter of poison and betrayal remains unspoken between us. A murmur swept through the cathedral, guests exchanging glances, Vivienne's father half rising from the front pew before catching himself, his face draining of colour in a way that told Sebastian everything he needed to know about the man's own part in the plot. Sebastian reached into his coat and drew out the folded copies of the courier note and Corwin's receipt, holding them aloft where the morning light through the cathedral's high windows caught the paper clearly. 3 weeks passed. A purchase was made at an apothecary in Blackwood, arranged through the household of Vivienne's own family, for a substance capable of harming a man slowly, quietly, without raising suspicion until it was far too late to trace its source. I have the shopkeeper's own record of the sale, along with a courier's note detailing precisely when and how it was meant to be delivered into my hands. "Lies," Vivienne said sharply, though her voice had lost the smooth confidence it carried only moments before. "Whatever forged papers you wave before these guests, they prove nothing but a servant's desperate attempt to escape justice for her own crimes." Sebastian had expected this, had prepared for it during the long, quiet hours in the huntsman's lodge, and he did not flinch from her accusation. "Then perhaps you will explain, before this gathering, why your own steward attempted to send an urgent letter to your father's estate only last evening, a letter naming the exact goblet meant to carry this poison, and the exact moment during today's celebration it was to be added." At this, movement stirred near the cathedral's rear entrance as Ambrose escorted Halloway forward, the steward's face pale and drawn, his hands bound loosely before him, having been quietly detained the previous night once his letter's true purpose had been confirmed beyond doubt. Halloway said nothing, his eyes fixed on the stone floor, though his silence spoke as loudly as any confession might have. Vivienne's composure cracked further at the sight of her steward, though she rallied one final time, drawing herself up with the particular pride of a woman unwilling to surrender even as the ground shifted beneath her. "Even if such a letter existed, it proves nothing was ever placed in today's ceremony. You accuse me of a crime with no true evidence of its completion, only papers and suspicion." Sebastian had known this moment would come, had planned for it with Nora across every whispered conversation since the huntsman's lodge, and he turned now toward the altar where the silver goblet, refilled since the morning's blessing with the wine meant for the celebratory toast, still sat waiting for the ceremony's next stage. "Then let us settle the matter simply," he said, lifting the goblet himself and extending it toward Vivienne across the small distance that separated them. "If these papers are forgeries, if no poison was ever intended for this cup, you will have no difficulty drinking from it now, before your father, before the Archbishop, before every guest gathered here to witness our union." The cathedral fell utterly silent. Vivienne stared at the goblet in Sebastian's outstretched hand, her face working through a series of expressions she could not quite master, defiance and calculation and, beneath it all, a fear she could no longer disguise. The wine within the goblet was not the tainted batch, Nora's exchange in the vestry having removed any true danger hours before. But Vivienne had no way of knowing this, no way of understanding that the very trap meant to catch her had already been sprung and reset without her knowledge. "I will not be made to perform for a crowd like some carnival act," she said finally, her voice tight. "Over papers and accusations from a servant girl with every reason to lie." "Then you refuse," Sebastian said quietly, and something in his tone carried more weight than any louder accusation could have managed. "You refuse to drink from a cup you claim carries nothing more dangerous than wine." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Vivienne's father finally rose fully from his pew, his face a mask of horror as he understood, at last, that his daughter's refusal had confirmed before the entire county what no amount of denial could now undo. Vivienne's hands trembled at her sides, and for a moment it seemed she might speak again, might attempt some final, desperate explanation. But no words came, only the slow, unmistakable recognition settling across every watching face that the wedding, and everything it had promised, had ended in this single moment of silence. The Archbishop, understanding the gravity of what had unfolded before him, stepped forward with quiet authority, gesturing for the estate's guards, who moved to Vivian's side without hesitation now that the truth stood plain before them all. She did not resist, though her face had gone rigid with a fury too great for words, as the guards led her from the altar and out through the cathedral's side entrance, her father following behind, his own reputation crumbling with every step. Sebastian set the goblet down carefully, his hands finally allowed to shake now that the danger had passed, and turned toward the cathedral's edge, where Nora still stood in her borrowed attendant's robes, the flask of true evidence hidden safely beneath the heavy fabric. Their eyes met across the stunned, murmuring crowd, and though neither spoke, the understanding between them needed no words at all. A quiet acknowledgement of everything they had risked and uncovered together since the night he first found her bound in a small, secluded cottage. The guests began to disperse in confused clusters, the wedding that would not now take place already becoming the subject of whispered speculation that would carry through the county for months to come. But Sebastian remained standing near the altar a long moment, watching Nora slowly lower her veil, feeling for the first time since that first terrible night that the truth had finally found its way into the light where it belonged.